The first time Cecily heard Edmund Vane speak, he was not speaking to her. He stood at the edge of the Grantham ballroom with one hand at his back, and his gaze moving across the room in the measured, unhurried way of a man who owned most of what he surveyed, and he said, quietly enough that only those nearest him could hear, "What a dreadful little gown." Sophia Alcott laughed, the sound bright and rehearsed, her diamonds catching the light from 3 chandeliers at once. She leaned half an inch toward Edmund and said, "Poor creature. One wonders who let her through the door." Cecily stood 7 feet away, at the edge of the same conversation, and she did not flinch. She had learned, somewhere in the long apprenticeship of watching her mother cut and pin and press fabric for other women's triumphs, that the face could be schooled even when the chest could not. She breathed through the hot flush that rose to her throat, and she looked straight ahead at the far wall, where 2 footmen in Grantham livery stood at identical angles. And she thought, with a steadiness that surprised even herself, "He is wearing a poorly knotted cravat for a man of his income, and his coat sits wrong at the left shoulder, and if my mother had dressed either of them this evening, she would have solved both problems before breakfast." She did not say this aloud. She was 22 years old, attending her first London season as the guest of her godmother, Mrs. Penelope Ford, and she was wearing the plainest gown her mother Agnes had made for her, a pale gray silk trimmed with ivory, which was neither plain nor dreadful, but which was restrained in the way that a woman restrains herself in a room where restraint will be misread as poverty. She turned away from Edmund Vane and walked toward the far side of the room, and the label he had placed on her settled onto her shoulders like something she could not shake off. Cecily had grown up in the back rooms of her mother's workroom on Gracechurch Street, and she knew what fabric cost and what it signified, and who chose it, and why. Agnes Marsh had been dressing the women of London's upper circles for 11 years, working from a modest shop that had no sign above the door, and needed none, because the women who wanted her work knew where to find her, and the women who did not were not the women she dressed. Agnes had an eye for structure that the French modistes could not match, and a discretion that her clients valued as much as the stitching, which was flawless. She did not gossip. She did not display her client list. She simply made the gowns, and the gowns were worn, and the women who wore them moved through their seasons with a confidence that had something to do with the fabric settling perfectly at the shoulder, at the waist, at the hem, in the way that correctly cut clothing produces a kind of physical certainty that no amount of money spent elsewhere can replicate. Cecily knew the name of every gown in that ballroom. She knew the figured silk on Lady Harrington's shoulders had been cut on the cross to account for Lady Harrington's tendency to pull left when she talked, and she knew the deep blue on Miss Pemberton had been chosen by Agnes to pull out the blue of her eyes because Miss Pemberton's mother had wept in the workroom, saying the girl had nothing else to recommend her, and Agnes had pressed the fabric sample to Miss Pemberton's cheek and said quietly that she was wrong. She knew the ivory on the Countess of Ryde, and the sage on Mrs. Fielding, and the rose gold on young Charlotte Grantham, their hostess's daughter, who had made her debut 3 weeks ago, and who was still carrying herself with the careful stiffness of a girl not yet comfortable in her own new territory. She moved through the room with this knowledge tucked inside her like a second spine, and she watched the room's men look at the women without knowing they were looking at her mother's work, and she felt, not for the first time, the particular invisibility of someone whose value is everywhere present and nowhere acknowledged, Mrs. Forde found her at the edge of the refreshment table and pressed a glass of ratafia into her hand and said in her comfortable, undimmed way, "You must not mind Lord Ashvale. He says cutting things because he has forgotten how to say anything else." "Lord Ashvale," Cecily said. "Edmund Vane, the Earl of Ashvale. He has been in mourning, in his own way, for rather a long time, and it has made him sharp in the manner of a tool kept too long unused." Mrs. Ford glanced across the room to where Edmund stood now, in conversation with a gray-haired man, his profile to them, the line of his jaw clean and precise as something quarried. "Do not let him decide anything about you, Cecily. He is not a reliable judge at present." Cecily nodded and sipped the ratafia, and did not tell her godmother that the judgment had already landed, that she had already felt it, that she was already doing the slow interior work of deciding whether to let it matter. She decided by the time the third set began that she would not let it matter. She was in London for 8 weeks at Mrs. Ford's insistence and expense, and she intended to see the season clearly and return to Gracechurch Street having learned what the world outside her mother's workroom looked like from the inside. She had not come to be chosen. She had come to observe. This resolution lasted until 11 in the evening, when young Charlotte Grantham descended the stairs from the gallery above the ballroom in the rose-gold gown Agnes had made her, and caught the hem on the iron finial at the base of the newel post, and the hem tore, not catastrophically, not even visibly to most of the room, but audibly, in the particular soft sound of French seam meeting an obstacle it was not built to survive. And Charlotte went pale in the way of a girl who has been in her new dress for exactly 3 weeks, and cannot yet imagine the world continuing after something goes wrong with it. Cecily was at her side before she had registered the decision to move. She had a small sewing kit in her reticule, the kind her mother had insisted she carry since childhood as a matter of practical religion, and she guided Charlotte gently to the alcove behind the staircase, and crouched in the dimness, and worked the repair with the quick and certain hands of someone who had spent her childhood learning to be useful before she learned to be decorative. Charlotte whispered, "How can I repay you?" And Cecily said, "You cannot. The gown deserved better than that newel post, and I am happy to have helped it." She tied off the thread, snipped it cleanly, and smoothed the seam flat with her thumb in the way her mother had taught her, pressing the warmth of her hand into the fabric to coax the silk back into its intended line. The repair was invisible. Charlotte would dance for the rest of the evening, and no one would know. Charlotte returned to the ballroom, and Cecily stood alone for a moment in the alcove's dimness, and heard the music resume. And only then did she notice the gallery above. She looked up because there was movement at its rail. The particular stillness of a person who has stopped moving and does not wish to be seen having stopped. Edmund Vane stood at the gallery rail with one hand resting on the wood and his eyes on the space she had just occupied. And even at the distance of 12 feet and a full story of height, she could see that something in him had shifted from its habitual arrangement. His face was not cold, precisely. It was careful, in the way of a man who has just seen something he was not prepared to see, and is deciding what to do with it. Their eyes met. Neither of them spoke. Cecily looked away first because she was the one with less authority to hold a gaze, and she walked back to the ballroom and did not permit herself to look back. She did not know what she had revealed by that small repair, or what he had understood by watching it. She would not know for some time. She was aware, in the marrow of her, that something had changed, though she had no framework yet to name it. If you find yourself returning to this story the way I imagine you might, leave a word in the comments. The quiet ones are always the easiest to overlook, and I do not want to overlook you. The morning after the Grantham ball, Cecily sat in Mrs. Ford's bright drawing room on Wimpole Street and wrote a letter to her mother. She described the ballroom, the gowns, the chandelier light on the silk of Lady Harrington's shoulders. The moment Charlotte Grantham's hem gave way, she did not describe the man at the gallery rail. She sealed the letter and gave it to the footman, and returned to the window. And the spring light on the street outside was very plain and very clean. And she felt, for a moment, the enormous distance between what she knew and what the world knew he knew. Edmund Vane was 31 years old, and he had been the Earl of Ashvale for 6 years. And he had been, in the opinion of every person who knew him, growing progressively colder since the death of his first wife, Catherine, 4 years ago in January of 1810. Catherine had been 24 years old and newly delivered of a stillborn son, and she had died of a fever that moved faster than the physicians could follow, and she had been buried in the gown Agnes Marsh had made for the christening that had not taken place. This was the detail Edmund could not unhook from the grief, not the funeral, not the empty nursery, but the gown made for joy put to work in sorrow, the specific wrongness of that, the way the fabric had been created for a celebration and had instead accompanied a burial. And he had never once in 4 years been able to look at a woman in a beautifully made gown without feeling something in him recoil, without registering the wrongness of beauty attached to loss, without punishing the sight of it with whatever word came first to his tongue. He did not understand this about himself. He understood only that beautiful things made him cold, and that coldness had become his primary instrument. His mother, Lady Dorothea Vane, had spent the better part of 3 seasons attempting to redirect his coldness into a marriageable channel. She had identified Miss Sophia Alcott 2 years prior as the correct choice, and she had been engineering their proximity with the patient craft of a woman who had spent 51 years arranging other people's circumstances to her preference. Sophia was 20 years old, the daughter of Sir Alfred Alcott of Berkshire, possessed of £8,000 and an equanimity that Dorothea found restful. More importantly, Sophia did not make Edmund flinch. Her gowns were all purchased from a French house in Bond Street, and their construction was fashionable rather than beautiful, in the particular way that Agnes Marsh's work was beautiful. And Edmund looked at her without the recoil, which Dorothea had correctly identified as the closest thing to warmth her son had produced in 4 years. The Ashvale dinner was held 3 weeks into the season, and Cecily attended because Mrs. Ford had been invited, and because Mrs. Ford went nowhere without Cecily in the current arrangement, and because Cecily had not yet found a graceful way to explain that she would prefer to spend the evening in the workroom on Gracechurch Street learning how to set a sleeve. The dinner was held in the great dining room of Ashvale House on Grosvenor Square, where the table was laid for 22, and the candlelight did what candlelight in a room that large always does, which is to make everyone look as though they are sitting inside a painting someone has not yet finished. Cecily was placed at the far end of the table, in the position reserved for guests whose connection to the host was indirectly social rather than personally consequential, and she accepted this placement with the equanimity of someone accustomed to the far end of tables. Sophia sat 3 seats from Edmund, which was close enough to constitute a statement. Dorothea sat at Edmund's right hand and managed the table's conversation with the precise efficiency of a woman who had been running dinner parties since before Cecily's mother had learned to thread a needle. She was dressed in deep burgundy, and the gown was one of Agnes's, though Cecily noticed that even Dorothea did not know whose hands had made it. Partway through the second course, Cecily became aware that Edmund was looking at her. Not with open attention, not with any warmth that could be named at a distance, but with the specific quality of a man who has recognized something he did not expect and is trying to understand what to do with the recognition. She met his gaze for a moment, and he looked away first. She thought, pressing her fork into a piece of dressed turbot, that this was interesting. After dinner, when the women had withdrawn and the room had rearranged itself into the smaller, warmer configuration of tea and conversation, Cecily found herself near the fire with Charlotte Grantham, who had been invited as a friend of Sophia's and who crossed the room to Cecily with the directness of a girl who remembers a kindness. They spoke for a quarter of an hour about nothing in particular, but it was warm and easy and real. And when Cecily looked up, it was to find Edmund standing in the doorway in the moment of the men's return. And his eyes had gone to her first, before they went to Sophia, before they went to his mother. He looked away when Dorothea reached his elbow and steered him, gently but with considerable purpose, toward Sophia, who rose to meet him with the grace of a woman who has been told she will be a countess and has had some time to practice the posture. Dorothea leaned close to him and said something Cecily could not hear. Whatever it was, it produced in Edmund's face the expression of a man being reminded of an obligation he had agreed to discharge. He nodded once, and Sophia smiled, and the conversation between them began. And it looked, from where Cecily sat, exactly like what it was, a careful negotiation between a man who was trying to feel something and a woman who had been correctly prepared for the role. Cecily set down her teacup and looked at the fire and felt nothing she had a right to feel, and reminded herself that she had not come to the season to be chosen. She left Ashvale House in Mrs. Ford's carriage at 11 o'clock, and the streets were cool, and the city was still doing what cities do at that hour, which is continue regardless, and she leaned her head against the window glass and thought about her mother's workroom, about the smell of warm silk and chalk, and the particular sound the scissors made on a long, straight cut, and she felt, for the first time, genuinely homesick. The following week was the hardest. Cecily attended 2 more engagements on Mrs. Ford's arm, and at each of them she watched the season proceed around her in its established patterns. She watched Sophia be positioned and repositioned like a piece moved on a board by a careful player who knew where the game was going. She watched Edmund move through rooms without warmth and be pursued by warmth anyway. She watched her mother's work on the backs and shoulders of women who would not have known to name it, and she felt the double invisibility of that, her own and Agnes's both. On a Thursday evening, 5 weeks into the season, she was passing through the corridor outside the small drawing room at the Pelham house when she heard Dorothea's voice through the half-open door. "She has nothing," Dorothea said, to someone whose response Cecily could not make out. No fortune, no connection, no name that carries any weight in this room. She is a seamstress's daughter attending on sufferance, and any attention Edmund has been observed to pay her is precisely the kind of attention a man pays a curiosity before he turns back to what is suitable. She is nothing, and she will be gone by the end of the month, and we shall hear nothing further of her. Cecily stood in the corridor with her hand at her side and the cool plaster of the wall an inch from her shoulder, and she understood several things at once. That Dorothea had noticed, that Dorothea had drawn a conclusion, and that the conclusion was organized entirely around the certainty that nothing Cecily could do would alter the room's verdict. She walked back to Mrs. Ford's side without turning toward the door, and she spent the rest of the evening in the careful performance of a woman who has heard nothing and expects nothing and intends to leave gracefully at the appointed hour. In the carriage going home, Mrs. Ford said, with her comfortable and undeceivable directness, "What happened?" "Nothing," Cecily said. Mrs. Ford looked at her for a long moment and then said, with great gentleness, "You are allowed to be angry, you know. It is not a failing." Cecily looked out the window at the London night and said, "I know." She did not say that she was not angry, precisely, or not only angry. She was also something else, something quieter and more determined, which was the feeling she associated with her mother's hands smoothing a difficult piece of fabric. The recognition that resistance in the material was not a reason to stop, but only information about where additional care was required. She made her decision that night in her room at Wimpole Street, sitting at the small writing desk in her nightgown, with the candle burning and the window dark against the spring dark outside. The final ball of the season was in 11 days, hosted by Lord and Lady Pelham, and she would attend it, and she would wear the gown. She wrote to her mother the next morning. She described what she wanted with the precision of a client who knew exactly what she was asking for, which was also the precision of a daughter who had grown up watching greatness being made from the inside. She asked for the cream and gold silk, the structured bodice, the sleeves that Agnes had been developing for 2 seasons, and which were, in Cecily's private assessment, the most quietly authoritative design her mother had ever attempted. She asked for it in 11 days. She said she was sorry for the timeline, and that she understood if it was not possible. Agnes sent the gown in 9 days, with a note that said only, "Wear it well." Cecily stood in front of the glass in Mrs. Ford's dressing room on the evening of the Pelham ball and looked at what her mother had made, and she felt, for the first time in 5 weeks, entirely herself. The cream was not pale, not washed out, not the shy retreat of a woman trying to disappear. It was a considered choice, the way the best things are considered, with a full understanding of what the room would contain and what would be needed to hold one's own in it. The gold thread at the sleeves and at the hem caught the candlelight in the glass and returned it quietly, not loudly, not with the aggressive brightness of diamonds, but with the steady luminosity of something that knew its own worth and had no need to announce it. Mrs. Ford saw her at the top of the stairs and said simply, "Agnes." "Yes," Cecily said. "Good," said Mrs. Ford. "Then let us go." The Pelham ballroom was lit by 4 chandeliers and attended by most of the season's company, which on this last occasion included everyone who had anything to settle or confirm before London emptied for the summer. Cecily entered the room on Mrs. Ford's arm and felt the first thing she noticed, that every woman in the room was wearing a gown her mother had made. She had known it in the abstract, had carried the client list in her memory like a private census, but standing in the room with the full company assembled and the light falling across silk and crepe and figured cotton in the particular shapes that Agnes's construction produced, she understood it with her body for the first time. The particular lift at the shoulder that was Agnes's signature economy, the way the skirts moved, the way the bodices sat against the body as though the fabric had been grown for that specific woman and not merely cut. 23 women in the room. Every gown her mother's, including her own. She took a glass of champagne from a passing tray and stood with Mrs. Ford near the west wall and watched the room arrange itself around its own certainties. And she waited for whatever the evening would bring. Edmund arrived at 9:30. He was dressed with the spare precision that she had, over 5 weeks, come to understand as his version of effort. Coat exactly fitted at both shoulders now, she noticed. The left corrected from the Grantham ball, cravat knotted cleanly. He entered with his mother on his arm, and Sophia at the half-step behind, that Dorothea had choreographed to suggest accompaniment without yet confirming commitment, and the room's attention moved toward him in the way a room's attention moves toward the person it has agreed to treat as its center. Dorothea's gaze swept the room and landed on Cecily with the flat, measuring quality of someone confirming a calculation. She believed she had solved the problem. Cecily could see this in her posture, in the particular set of her shoulders, in the way she held her fan at a height that communicated that everything was proceeding according to the arrangement she had made. She had not solved the problem. Edmund had stopped moving. He stood at the room's edge, and his eyes had found Cecily in the way that eyes find the thing they have been looking for without admitting they were looking. And he was still in the way he had been, still at the gallery rail 6 weeks ago. That specific quality of a man whose habitually disciplined body has encountered something stronger than its discipline. His eyes moved from her face to her gown, with the slow, careful attention of a man who was not looking at what was fashionable, or what was correct, or what the season approved, but at something that had struck a different register entirely. He knew Agnes Marsh's work. He had known it for 4 years, in grief and in guilt, and in the displaced fury that grief and guilt produce when they have nowhere honest to go. He had looked at Catherine's burial gown in his mind every night for 4 years, turning the memory over like a stone that wouldn't sit flat, and he had punished beauty ever since because beauty in fabric had the specific shape of loss for him. He understood, in this moment, standing in the Pelham ballroom at the end of a season that had not produced the outcome his mother intended, that he had been punishing the wrong thing. What he had said at the Grantham ball about a dreadful little gown was the accusation of a man who was afraid of what he was seeing, and what he was seeing was the same quality of care that had dressed Catherine, and what he had refused to understand until this moment was that the care was not the source of the loss. He had only punished it as though it were. This understanding arrived quietly, without theater. Edmund was not a man given to theater. He was a man who, when he finally understood something, acted on it without delay. He crossed the room, not directly, not in the way a man crosses a room for something frivolous. He moved with the unhurried purposefulness of a man who has made a decision and is carrying it out, and the room registered this with the sensitive social instrument it had been all season, because the direction he was moving was not toward Sophia, and it was not toward the elder gentleman near the fireplace, and it was not toward the refreshment table at the far end. He was crossing toward the west wall, and toward Mrs. Ford, and toward the young woman in cream and gold who had stood at the Grantham ball in a plain gray gown, and repaired a torn hem in an alcove, and asked nothing in return for it. Dorothea's fan stilled. Sophia's smile did not waver. Precisely. But something behind it recalibrated with the quick intelligence of a woman who has been told she is the only possible choice, and is now watching the man she expected make a different one. And the recalibration was the kind that produced, in Sophia's interior, the single honest thought she had managed all season. Perhaps she had never wanted this particular arrangement as much as she had wanted to want it. Edmund stopped in front of Cecily, and the room was quiet enough around them that the nearest 20 people would hear what he said. And he looked at her gown for a moment, with the expression of a man who is at the full extent of what his face is capable of showing when it has been locked for 4 years, and then he said, "Agnes Marsh." It was not a question. He was naming the maker of the gown. Cecily said, steadily, "My mother, yes." He said, "Every gown in this room." "Yes," she said. "She has been dressing the women of this company for 3 seasons. She has an establishment on Gracechurch Street." He nodded once, and the nod carried a weight that she felt, rather than saw, the weight of a man reckoning with something he had said publicly and is preparing to retract publicly, which is the most expensive form of honesty available to a person of his rank. He said, "I owe your mother an apology." He paused, and then he said, with a precision that was not coldness, but the opposite of coldness, the exact thing that lived on the other side of coldness when a man finally arrived there, "I owe you one as well. What I said at the Grantham ball was said from ignorance of something I should have understood before I opened my mouth. I did not understand it. I understand it now." The room was listening. The room was the same room that had listened to Sophia being positioned and Dorothea arranging and the season proceeding in its established direction, and it was now hearing something different from the direction it had been expecting, and it was adjusting, the way rooms adjust when the person they have granted authority to uses that authority differently than predicted. Mr. Holt, the Ashvale solicitor, had arrived at the ball at Edmund's specific request. He stood at the room's edge with a folded document that Edmund had prepared the previous afternoon, which concerned a commission for Agnes Marsh to supply the gowns required for the Ashvale household in perpetuity, formalizing in writing what Edmund intended to say in the room, which was that Agnes Marsh's work was not merely acceptable to the earldom, but preferred by it, and that her daughter was not a seamstress's child attending on sufferance, but a young woman of specific and demonstrable worth, whom the earldom was pleased to recognize. Edmund did not look at the document. He had asked for it because he was a man who understood that public words required procedural confirmation, and he had asked Holt to hold it because he wanted the room to know that this was not an impulse, but a considered act. He kept his eyes on Cecily. He said, "Will you do me the honor of the next set, Miss Marsh?" The label Dorothea had applied in the Pelham corridor 9 days ago. Nothing. No fortune. No connection. No name that carries weight. Was still in the air, technically speaking. The room had heard that label in one form or another across 5 weeks and had accepted it as the season's working verdict. The man who had delivered the first label at the Grantham ball was now asking her to dance, in his own right, in front of the full company of the season's end. Cecily said, "Yes, Your Grace," because the form of address required it, and because the word yes was the whole of what she wished to say. Dorothea moved 1 step toward them, and then stopped. And the stoppage was not a decision so much as a recognition. That Edmund had crossed the room in front of witnesses. That Mr. Holt was standing at the room's edge with a folded document. That the thing she had been arranging for 3 seasons had been overridden not by sentiment, but by her son's specific and public act of correction. She was too intelligent a woman to contest this in the arena where he had just acted. The recognition of having miscalculated settled over her with the particular gravity of a woman who has built her certainty on the wrong foundation and is only now, at the moment of collapse, understanding which stone was load-bearing. She closed her fan and held it at her side, and what moved behind her eyes in that moment was something close to the beginning of a reckoning with her own accounting of the situation. Sophia stood 3 feet from Dorothea and held very still, and thought, with the clear and finally honest appraisal of a young woman who is being released from an expectation she had not chosen for herself, that she was not unhappy. This was also new information. Edmund offered Cecily his hand, and she placed hers in it, and he led her onto the floor. The music was a country dance, which required a measure of practical navigation through the room's other pairs, and so they moved through the set with the careful attention that dancing in company demands, and they did not speak much, because the dance did not permit it. What passed between them was carried in the body's language instead, in the way he turned toward her at the moments when the figure of the dance brought them close, in the way his hand at her back had the quality of intention rather than convention, in the way she felt, for the first time in this season, that the room around her was not a courtroom, but simply a room, full of people doing what people did in rooms, and that she was permitted to be in it, without apology. When the music ended, and they separated at the room's edge, Cecily found Mrs. Ford at her elbow and Charlotte Grantham beyond her, Charlotte's face entirely open with the uncomplicated delight of someone too young yet to manage the expression. Mrs. Ford said nothing. She put her hand briefly on Cecily's arm, and the warmth of it said everything that needed saying about what 5 weeks of watching had produced in a woman who had loved Cecily's mother for 20 years and had brought Cecily to London for reasons she had not fully articulated, but which had always been, at their root, about this: the possibility that the right person might see what was there. Mr. Holt appeared at Edmund's side, and they spoke for a moment in low voices, and Edmund signed the commission document on a writing table near the door, and Holt folded it back into his coat pocket and gave a small correct bow, and withdrew. The commission was sealed, Agnes Marsh's name was now formally attached to the Ashvale household, and that name would appear on cards and correspondence and invoices from this season forward, and the 3 seasons of anonymous work would be, at last, a matter of record. The ball continued for another 2 hours, and Cecily danced once more, with a pleasant young man whose name she would not remember by morning. And she drank a second glass of champagne and spoke with Charlotte Grantham about nothing consequential. And she felt the particular exhaustion of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has only just been permitted to set it down. Edmund was across the room for most of that time, doing what earls do at the close of a season, speaking with the men whose conversations shaped the following quarter's business. He did not look at her constantly. He did not need to. The look he had given her on the dance floor was sufficient, the kind of look that resolves something rather than opening it. And what it had resolved was the question she had been refusing to ask for 5 weeks about whether she was visible to anyone in that room who mattered. She was visible to him. That was the answer. They left London for Ashvale in Derbyshire at the end of June, the 3 of them, Cecily and Edmund and Mrs. Ford, who had been invited with the warmth of a man who understood that some obligations were debts of the heart and not merely of courtesy. The journey took 2 days, and the Derbyshire roads were bad in the way that Derbyshire roads always are, and the carriage was not precisely comfortable, but the country outside the window was extraordinary, the particular green of late June in the north, and Cecily watched it with the feeling of someone arriving somewhere she did not know she had been traveling toward. Ashvale was a gray stone house set against a hill, older than elegance, comfortable in the way that houses which have been lived in by many generations become comfortable, worn smooth by use without apology. It had a garden that needed attention, and a library that did not, and a small music room with a piano that had been left mid-phrase on the open score since Catherine died. The pages of the Haydn sonata still turned to the last movement she had played. Agnes arrived in July with her workroom's full complement, including 2 of her apprentices who were wide-eyed at the scale of the commission and grateful for the extra pay, and she spent 3 weeks measuring and fitting and listening to the house's requirements with the same attentive intelligence she brought to a new client's first appointment. She did not meet Edmund for 2 full days after her arrival, and when she did, it was in the corridor outside the linen room. And he said, "Mrs. Marsh, your daughter has told me a great deal about your work. I should have understood it earlier." Agnes looked at him for a long moment, with the direct and unceremonious gaze of a woman who has spent 30 years reading people for a living. And then she said, "Yes, you should have," and went back to measuring the linen room curtains. Edmund allowed himself, very briefly, something almost like a smile. The wedding was in October, in the village church at the foot of the Ashvale Hill, and it was attended by the estate's tenants, and by Mrs. Ford, and by Charlotte Grantham and her mother, and by Holt, who drove up from London with his wife and their 2 young children, and sat in the second pew, with the comfortable air of a man who has witnessed a great deal of important paperwork, and found this particular document the most satisfying. The church was cold in the October way of old stone buildings, and there were no diamonds, and the gown was Agnes's work, the last thing she would make before handing the Ashvale commission to her apprentices and retiring to the house in the village that Edmund had arranged as part of the commission agreement. Quietly, through Holt, without being asked. Cecily wore cream again, a different cream from the Pelham ball. Warmer, deeper, the color of good candlelight rather than bright spring morning. And when she walked down the aisle, it was without a procession of attendants or a fanfare of any kind, because neither she nor Edmund was a person who required an audience to confirm what they already knew. He stood at the front of the church and watched her come, and his face had the expression she had first seen at the gallery rail of the Grantham ballroom, that careful, collected openness, the mask not removed but permanently altered, cracked through in the way of old ice over a river when the season finally turns, letting light through at the fracture. He took her hand at the front of the church, and the vicar began. And outside the window, the first snow of the year was starting. Small and tentative. The way first snow always is, as though it is uncertain whether to commit. That evening, in the drawing room at Ashweile, with the fire built up against the October cold, and the snow now committed and falling steadily past the tall windows, Agnes's last gown for the house hung in the dressing room upstairs in the careful way her work always hung, never folded, always aired, as though the fabric had its own dignity and deserved to rest in the arrangement it had been created for. Mrs. Forday sat in the chair nearest the fire with her embroidery, content in the specific way of a woman who has successfully engineered the thing she came to engineer, and can now rest. And the piano in the music room was silent, because Edmund had turned the Haydn sonata's pages and found the first movement and begun again from the beginning that afternoon. Quietly, the notes finding their footing slowly at first, then steadying, the way things steady when they have been left too long and are finally resumed. Cecily sat by the window with her hands in her lap and watched the snow come down on the Ashvale garden and felt the house settle around her, the particular sound a house makes when it is cold outside and warm inside, and the fire is correct, and the people in the rooms are where they belong. She thought of her mother's workroom on Gracechurch Street, the smell of warm silk and chalk, the scissors on a long, straight cut. She thought of Charlotte Grantham's torn hem, and the alcove, and the gallery rail. She thought of the label that had been spoken in the Grantham ballroom before she had said a single word in London, and she thought of the way it had been answered, not by her, but by the room's own recognition that the verdict had been wrong. The snow made no sound against the glass, which was the quality she had always loved best about it. She was home. If Cecily's story moved you, leave a comment telling me which moment stayed with you longest. And if you have not yet found this channel, a quiet subscription is the simplest way to stay close to the next one.